Okay, so maybe I'll just start quickly with some immediate just thoughts and then invite everyone to sort of join in the discussion. So I found this film really interesting because it took me back. For starters, I should say, some of you know already, but for those of you who don't, I'm Asli, a teacher in the International Law program, but on September 11th, 2001, I was a lawyer practicing in New York at a firm that was located at the World Trade Center complex, and so I experienced a lot of these moments firsthand in the ways that you just did in this film. Some of you may not have had that visceral memory because you may have been young at the time of the September 11th attacks, might not remember it as directly, or you maybe lived on the West Coast and experienced it in a different way, but the immediacy of those moments, the feeling of being under threat, the sense of looming prospective attacks and so on, I think is captured in the way that this film feels dated, because that may not be the experience that we have now when we think about this anniversary, while at the same time, that other sense of threat, the sense of being from a community that's isolated and identified as responsible in some way, either because by appearance being assimilated into a racialized category that has been racialized as threat, or because in fact from a Muslim background. So obviously for me personally, as a Muslim American who had spent a large part of her life in New York, was in practice in New York, all of those feelings were colliding at once, while also trying to puzzle through how to respond to the ways in which national policy was being shaped and the direction that national and international framings were taking, whether it be the description of these events as a war as opposed to a crime, whether it be the response in the reorganization of the government around the executive branch, the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, the multiplication of ways in which we were told that if you see something, you should say something. And all of this, when we were thinking about doing something, every year that I've been here at UCLA, we've done something to mark this anniversary. And at the decade mark, we did a big panel that looked at civil liberties in the aftermath of the September 11th attacks. And this year, especially given the election cycle that we're in, it felt important to mark again the ways in which not only was this a national trauma, but it was also a national trauma that produced a racialized framework and one that has affected many of us. And as it happens, either by luck or lack of luck, I was in New York again on Saturday of this weekend because I was on the East Coast to give some talks, and I was still there on Saturday, and it so happens that I actually grew up around 23rd Street, and so I was in this neighborhood where the bombing just occurred. And obviously, as we've learned today, that bombing, again, is being identified with someone, an Afghan American who is going to be framed as an immigrant, a South Asian, a Muslim, a person that represents the personification of threat in this difficult election cycle. So for me, all of this means that it's that much more important to have a sense of community and have an opportunity to engage, to think about discursively and viscerally and emotionally and politically how we mark these anniversaries. And so for me, for that reason, and also because the film was made by a student who was even younger than most of the students in this audience today at the time that she was making the film, but who herself went on to become a law student and then a lawyer, operationalizing some of these experiences and thinking about how to work on civil rights questions, seemed like a good, fitting framing opportunity for us to start a conversation. So with that sort of prelude about just my own personal experience of the anniversary, but also of this particular narrative, I would love to open it up. And I think there are many ways to, of course, have critical engagement with this as a text, or to think more generally about the questions that are put on the table. So I just want to open it up and invite you guys to offer any comments that you might have for us to start a discussion. And I know that creates an awkward silence initially, but we're going to power through that awkwardness until someone has the courage to say something, because we did share 90 minutes, and there's both room for engagement and criticism, so I'm sure in your own minds you formulated both. I'd just like to hear you share those thoughts.
I have a question. I understand, what was the name? I understand the name of the mafias, but I'm thinking about the unity and the peace. What causes different generations to have so much anger with itself? Is it the independence or survival, or besides the arrogance or the insecurity on why they will hurt each other? I notice they do a lot of killing of And is it a mass of anger, insecurity, or survival?
So I'm
Or would you
going to
learn
just
how to do things?
take this as an opportunity to engage with some questions that you've raised. I'm not certain of the framework that you had in mind, but I would say that what this film describes as a text is the ways in which people experiencing an attack channel their anger by trying to identify people that they can hold responsible for that attack, even if those people have no relationship to the attack. They look for targets within their immediate community with which to perform either their sense of patriotism or their sense of regaining control over the situation because they feel under assault. So I think that's what this has described for us as a film. I'm going to ask just to have an opportunity to have the conversation be a little broader, but I do think what this film has shown is a community that came under threat, that had no relationship, as basically all communities in the United States essentially have either no or very, very limited relationship to the circumstances of these attacks, and yet had to watch unfold a kind of framing in which people, wherever they may have been in the country, came to represent a symbol of something that would be held responsible for the attacks. And that's the way in which this film at least tries to help us chart one community's experience of racialized hate crimes in the aftermath of a set of attacks that were ultimately attacks equally against them as members of the U.S. community, as Americans, whether they're living in Arizona or anywhere else. So that's what this film laid out, and I would encourage all of us to think about ways in which it did that successfully and less successfully.
Yeah, because I
So
think
I'm still
Yes.
forming like coherent. I'm still trying to form how I feel like how it felt about the film, but because I went from being kind of frustrated to really acknowledging how important the film is and continues to be. I think right now what's going through my head is like, for me watching it in a weird way, it felt super far removed from my reality, but at the same time, really, really close to my reality. I say far removed because for many of us in the Muslim community, like we were also in crisis mode. I was at the time enrolled in an Islamic school, and we didn't go to school for like a week and a half, and because they closed it because it wasn't safe for us to go. The police weren't protecting the mosque, so like my dad was going at 2 a.m. like patrolling the neighborhood, like and the mosque building. At the same time, so like it was a little frustrating that I think a lot of those narratives were not included in the film. You know, when she put up the map, those were predominantly Muslim names and Arab names that were victims, and to not even engage that was very frustrating. But at the same time, I recognize the importance of the film because it showed like just how huge the impact of these policies were on how they were institutionalizing kind of these discriminatory policies and how badly that had an effect on everybody, not just people like from my own circle.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry.
I'm just interested in these respectability politics. 15 years later, do we still need to pledge allegiance to a flag and bleed red, white, and blue and all those things in order to be like allowed to live? I think that it's really understandable at the time in the moment when even in the film they were saying we were so scared, but I think like especially marking 15 years, have we not seen that doesn't humanize us? There's flags everywhere, like even in family homes, like my family homes, there's flags in all of these gas stations, but none of that stops it. So I don't know, it was a bit frustrating to see that because we know it doesn't work. We can, and why should it work? It would be perhaps insulting to I don't know, to how we are as a society to say that these groups, these Muslims and those perceived as such have to be held to this standard. They have to go and fight in our imperial wars. They have to go and kill other people abroad in order to come back and be considered human, except you don't even get that.
Yeah, I mean, I think these are important questions. First, I want to respond to Aisha's point, which is well taken. I mean, so obviously this is a film about the experience of the Sikh community. And again, in each year, we've had different ways of framing our engagement with this anniversary, and this is a year in which this was the film that is a film that represents one of the important experiences that occurred in the aftermath of the attacks. And I will say, by the way, as someone who then had the same experience as the person from the Sikh American Legal Aid and Defense and Education Fund, finding oneself, emerging as a young lawyer and suddenly confronted with this unbelievable experience in which you're representing people in circumstances you can't even begin to, you would never have imagined, were not the context in which you thought civil rights would be defended. Just as an example, in my own case, and again, many of you who know me individually may know the stories, but my first response was to try to represent men who'd been picked up from immigrant communities, largely Muslim, South Asian, Arab men, and who'd been detained in the New York, New Jersey areas. And the purpose of the representation was to get these men deported. That was the rights remedy that was available at that moment for these men, because to remain in detention meant to remain under circumstances in which they were being held in mixed facilities and being labeled as terrorists, and in which their lives were at risk at all times, and in which they were confronting very serious violence, for which they had absolutely no possible defense. These were largely slight men in their 40s, middle class in their own homes, that had come to send remittances back and basically desperately wanted to leave, whose families thought they had died in the attacks because they had disappeared off the streets after the attacks because of the kinds of arrest practices that were made clear in that train incident that you saw, except that they came from a very different class profile and had a very different immigrant status and therefore could be detained indefinitely. And the practice of indefinite detention, which we now associate with the framing of the war on terror, began with just immigration civil detainers here in the United States, literally on September 12th. So that was a very unusual experience, as you might imagine. And it was an experience in which Muslims and Arabs in the immediate post 9/11 period had not built civil rights organizations that had meaningful bridges to the rest of the civil rights community. And therefore it was an extremely isolating period in which you couldn't get into legal coalition easily, and you couldn't identify partners easily, and the community that was the very first partner there immediately was the Sikh community, forming in their own legal defense and education fund formations, the Sikh Coalition and many other organizations across the country, reaching out immediately to mosques, reaching out immediately to Arab community centers to ask what could be done, and immediately engaging in introductions in towns and cities where there was no civil rights organization at all for Muslims at that moment. So first I want to mark that as a moment in which really the experience was, as you say, both very close and very far, but it was the one community that instantly identified and wanted to build that bridge. So that was a very powerful and important thing, and I think something worth honoring 15 years later. And then turning to Sarah's point, which is also a very good point, we saw it, embodied in some ways in the Democratic National Convention this year, in which you have that performance, and part of your question is, do we need to instrumentally perform patriotism? And of course, that's one way of framing it, but for some of the communities I think that were reflected here in this film, they didn't experience it as instrumental. They experienced it as existential. In other words, identitarian. They viewed it as normatively something that they genuinely embraced. And that is something that is part of the American experience as much as rejecting instrumental uses of patriotism. I mean, there's a spectrum of what the Muslim experience looks like, what the South Asian experience looks like, what the Sikh experience looks like. There are going to be people who do actually experience their existence in the United States as part of an American fabric that embraces these symbols, and there are those who, of course, have a critical stance. And what's missing, to some extent, and it really reflects the time, and you nailed it, you said 15 years later, do we need to perform this? But in those 2 years, there wasn't a lot of, I mean, of course there was questioning, there was criticism, and this was the lead up to the Iraq War. So there were plenty of opportunities to dissent from American foreign policy. But you can already see as a text how different it is than it might be if a 20-year-old student today were to make a comparable film. So I think it is both an important critique and also an important way of getting into the moment that this film is chronicling to understand why the distance that you experience now may not have been as available at that moment, even for those who take a more critical perspective. And I'm not sure the notion of this as strictly instrumental is one that would have fit as comfortably at that moment.
Yeah, I think it's a great history of movement for all colleges and school and different cultures and race. Especially the new race that's coming out of Race Tag. I think it's a great movie to show.
Well, one great thing that we have at UCLA Law is the Dean of Students Office, which helps support these kinds of showings and has really made it possible for us to engage with many of these questions more deeply and invite students into a really significant conversation about how we should think about race and politics in moments when we find ourselves to be under pressure because of events in the nation or events in our immediate context, or because of being events on our campus. So we can be really grateful to Tony Tolbert, who's here with us today, and to the Dean's Office in general for the support that enables some of these conversations to happen. But I also want to open it up so that I responded to the first 2 or 3 comments with my own sort of thoughts and anecdotes, but obviously we can be having a conversation with one another. And I also said at the beginning that I'm mindful of everyone's time, but I do hope that we can have a little bit more conversation before we break up after having spent 90 minutes with this film. So I want to just invite more, especially students, comments or engagement, if anyone has. And Jessie, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just curious, actually, a question for the students, just especially right now, given the time with Trump and a lot of the awful things that come out of his mouth, a lot of the incidents and violence against communities of color, the issues of Islamophobia, Orlando, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, how are students, how have you been finding it affecting your communities, and how have you been finding, how have you also been finding space for organizing, and also, of course, balancing that with the fact that, you've got a lot on your plate. I mean, I'm just curious as far as how this has affected your values right now. And if, the 15th
Yes.
anniversary of that.
I come from actually 40 minutes from where that Fresno, so it's a kind of a conservative valley, a lot of white people, to be honest, and so it's like anyone who knows us in that valley, I'm Muslim, and my father's like visually Arab, and there's a lot of Trump supporters, but we're always considered like that token, like, oh, you're different for some reason. It's like, how are we different? And so I guess how, there's not like a huge Arab community, so like I can't say how it's affected our community, but rather it's like how racist leaning people, I will say, can kind of view their interactions with individual people, but somehow they take that apart from the abstract statements that Trump says and the kind of generalization and Islamophobic statements and everything like that.
Well, I know that since in this election cycle, I guess, I'm not Muslim, but I'm ambiguous. Ambiguous enough that even in the last year, I've had 3 or 4 men approach me and accuse me of being racist and asking me, what are you doing here, all this sort of stuff. I had a police officer in Minneapolis asked me if I was Afghanistani, which I didn't choose that moment to correct him about. but then proceeded to tell me he would shoot me in the parking lot if I was just whatever. So it's like I feel it, and like I feel for all the other people that are correctly or incorrectly as identified in the movie. It's not like, oh, you're mistaken and therefore I'm okay. It's like, oh, what you're doing is like a huge problem. But I think something that I dislike about the discourse around Trump, even in progressive or liberal circles, is how much it obfuscates that you're it makes it seem like a choice between like the correct politics and like Trump, where it's like it like removes any sort of criticism of Hillary Clinton's involvement in this sort of stuff, or like as if you're making a choice that's like, oh, one person's like in complete support and the other person is like completely against you. I think it makes it so that you have to choose sides you might not necessarily want to be choosing. But I feel that along with obviously his anti-immigrant, anti-Mexican comments too. But yeah, no, it seems it's almost crazy how much empowerment is going toward attacks, I would say, and I see it getting into it.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I was asking is I was listening. So one of my good friends hosts this podcast, which some of you might have heard, Good Muslim, Bad Muslim. I don't know if anyone's listened to that. Yeah, so one of my good friends, Taz, she hosts it, and I was just listening to their most recent episode. And every episode, they just give a recap. It's once a month, and they do a recap of hate crimes. This most recent one, I mean, she was just saying that I mean, they both were getting a little frustrated and saying that, you know, we have nothing new to say about these hate crimes. There's more. These are really atrocious. And, you know, she was saying that, God, I'm really glad we only do this podcast once a month, even though it seems like it's not timely because, you know, things keep happening. But if I had to do this weekly, I'd just kill myself. And these are also activists who are immersed in these things, but it's really heavy to bear, and that it does seem as though it's not letting up. So that's why I was curious how that's, you know, how that's played out on a personal, individual level, or even as a collective level, as a community, you know, students also, and how you guys have managed that.
I think one of the things I've been thinking a lot more, I would say in the past 2 years about is my hijab. And I don't know why. I haven't thought about it before. Actually coming to UCLA, like in New York, I would think about it, but not about taking it off. And I think that's one of the things that people around me and people who are close to me and my family have probed more than once as a issue of safety. And myself, like I fly alone a lot, and I think about it when I'm flying and like interactions that I've had and how they would play out differently if I wasn't wearing it. And I don't know, it's just something that I didn't imagine me ever having to like actually, like I didn't ever think it would get so bad that like I would be afraid to wear it in certain spaces.
I've been wearing hijab for 14 years now, and I like get called, in the past like 6 months, I've been called a terrorist at least once a month. I'm just walking in a grocery store, walking like 3 weeks ago, we were at my friend's birthday, and like, you know, this guy just passes by us, not like, okay, I don't want it, like a very well-dressed, looks like he's in the restaurant with us, you know, and he's just like whispers ISIS at me. It's happening so much more now that it makes me like that much hyper aware when I'm going into a space that I look different. Whereas I've worn it long enough to be able to tell when things are really bad. It's been really bad. And like even I'm thinking a lot about this, like the listing of hate crimes. I think about all the hate crimes that are not considered hate crimes. Like it's like now things are happening all the time in mosques, and it's like you have to fight for it to be considered a hate crime. I don't even know, like, is that a space for organizing? Yeah, but it's also, like, exhausting. You don't want to have to constantly say that a guy who got ambushed and beat up by a stranger as he's leaving the mosque is a hate crime. Like, whatever, but that's a whole other thing.
I wore hijab for 6 years until recently, and I stopped wearing it. And there's a number of reasons, and I think it would be dishonest for me to narrow it down to one, but I would be lying if I said that the safety thing wasn't part of it. And perhaps more than that, it was wanting to feel human again, because what I felt a lot when wearing hijab was like, okay, well that's an Islam over there, and before you were human, you were a representative of Islam, for better or for worse, and that's dehumanizing in its own ways. I think what's sad is that I started wearing it like 6 years ago, wanting to not be reduced to my appearance, and I stopped wearing it for the same reasons. And it's sad because I miss it, and perhaps in another world, in different times, I would maybe wear it again, but excuse my language, the shit you see when you wear that and the stuff you have to experience, it's unbelievable. Like, it's dehumanizing, and it takes so much energy to prove your humanity beyond that, to prove that you're someone who exists beyond the labels Muslim. Everything you do, every statement you make, every decision you make, every little choice is somehow a function of Islam, and that is a really heavy burden to carry, especially these days.
Interestingly enough, I also used to wear the hijab, but not to demonize your experience, but the reason why I took it off, it was for multiple reasons, but it had nothing to do with safety for me. I think that, I don't know, I'm really optimistic about how far we've come, and I know that narrative is like, kind of like, I hate to say it, but I feel like there are a lot of there's a lot of representation when it comes to Muslim women being in TV shows and fashion, and just they're more in like the public sphere, and that's something that I find like really exciting because those are like my friends and my mom and things like that, and who I used to be. But I find, I mean, for me, hijab was kind of like something that within my community I didn't feel comfortable. I guess like gender, and like it was like gendered in a way that I wasn't comfortable with. But I don't know what else to say, but yeah.
I mean, I think that's a exciting message to hear from anyone at the moment, that we've come a long way. It is a nice thing to hear, because seeing the images of George W. Bush in those early days reminds me of resonances with some of the things that we're hearing now in this current presidential election cycle. So it can feel very cyclical. But you're right that I think there's much more representation, variety of mainstream contexts, and also just you're starting from a different starting point. So even if we find some of the national narrative getting reset, there are a number of things that have come out of this conversation that are worth keeping in mind, that we have also as a Muslim community, and just as communities that experience these crimes beginning in the aftermath of the September 11th attacks, have now formed those bridges. There are alliances, there are many, many more civil rights platforms and other ways in which we're engaged with multiple communities across the board, seeking to try to advance a common agenda around racial equality. But also, there are ways in which we've learned to disable some of the narratives that became so potent in the immediate aftermath of September 11th attacks. I think it's worth noting Manuel's point that, in focusing on Trump, we forget about Hillary Clinton, or we forget about the broader political spectrum. Actually, at the 10th anniversary, my talk was almost entirely about the ways in which the Bush administration framing had become more entrenched and more institutionalized under President Obama. A narrative that also is forgotten now, as we're already sort of in paroxysms of nostalgia for President Obama, because we're so, grief-stricken at our current political spectrum. So it's worth remembering that it isn't only about the identity of the person who is in the executive or at the national level. It has become, for better or worse, institutionalized through every branch of our government, and these are practices that we've come to identify and understand better, and so also seek to disrupt. So there's an optimistic story, certainly, the one that you just helped us end on, I think, but there's an undercurrent within that optimistic story of concern. So anyway, I hope that this is just the beginning of a set of conversations that we can have along these themes, and I think the experiences of our students in particular is something that's incredibly important to the law school as a whole, certainly to the critical race studies community. So I want everyone in the room that's shared in this conversation to remember it and take forward with them that there is a community that is interested in these experiences, but also in thinking about how to empower you and stand in solidarity with you at any moment when you feel the way that Emmanuel described, or Aisha, or anyone else, of feeling either more visible or identified or in some way rendered insecure, basically, as a consequence of just who you are and your identity. We're precisely here as a community to disrupt those kinds of interpersonal interactions that may happen to you while you're a member of this law school community. That's something that is absolutely our agenda. So I want to encourage you to keep that conversation continuing, and also to engage with me and Justine and Tony and others at the law school with whom you feel connected, to make sure that we're aware of what's going on, to the extent that there's anything we can be doing to engage, intervene, interrupt any experience that you might be having that's reflective of some of these broader concerns that we're experiencing as a nation, especially as we go into this election cycle. So anyway, on that note, thank you so much for coming and for helping to mark this anniversary as a community. So thanks.
And thank you to Professor Bali for helping us organize this and for leading our discussion. Being a huge source of support for CRS and all students.